Welcome to our continuing exploration of Luke's understanding that the followers of Jesus were called to a faith based on a commitment to the life of agape love revealed in the life of Jesus. No strings attached. Those persons who were Jews seeking to follow Jesus, they were accustomed to being obedient to the rules and the laws. And Luke's presentation has been you don't have to be obedient to the law to follow Jesus, for Jesus is new and different, an understanding of faith that requires commitment rather than obedience. Now, this week we begin with Luke's first story of the movement, not the life of Jesus in the gospel according to Luke, but the story of the movement of the Acts of the Apostles. And the first story he tells is the story of the Jewish festival of Pentecost. Now, I've decided to really grasp the meaning of this first story of the movement that's recorded in the book of Acts. I think it's helpful to dig into 4 different understandings that are key to us moving forward in Luke's second volume. We're going to dig deeper this morning into the meaning of Pentecost, the meaning of Spirit, the meaning of the Trinity, and the meaning of the movement. Now, this would be good for a full semester's class, meeting 2 or 3 times a week for many weeks, but we're going to attack it in this one session. First, the meaning of Pentecost. Now, it's important to understand that the Feast of the Pentecost was celebrated by Jews for 1,000 years before the life of Jesus. It's still celebrated by Jews today, 2,000 years after the death of Jesus. It's under a different name, Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, which was a festival of harvest, 50 days or 7 days, 7 weeks following the wheat harvest. The festival also remembers the experience of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God. Therefore, it can be assumed that this first story is about Jews who gathered to celebrate the festival and were committed to follow Jesus. For the movement to follow Jesus was first within the Jewish community. Again, let me say that again. The movement to follow Jesus was first within the Jewish community. The first followers, including the disciples, were Jews. Now, this story of Pentecost in the book of Acts separates the meaning of Pentecost for the Christian tradition. It's no longer the Feast of the Weeks. It's the first story in the gathering of the movement. And it separates the meaning of Pentecost from the historic meaning of the Feast of Pentecost for the Jewish traditions. Pentecost for Christians marked the experience of the Spirit of God, which launched the community of faith of those who follow Jesus, celebrated 50 days after Easter. So Christians sort of borrowed the tradition and the timing, but not the meaning. For Pentecost is the story of the coming of the Spirit. Now, a final word of clarification. Everybody said, well, what does the word Pentecost mean? It's from the Greek word Pentecoste. And what does that mean? 50th. That's all that word technically means, 50th, which has to do with the timing, not the meaning. So that's Pentecost. But now let's look at the meaning of Spirit. The Holy Spirit was experienced by these new followers of Jesus, who were also Jews who were gathered for their feast of the Pentecost. Now, the Greek word translated Spirit is paraclete, Paraclete, paraclete. Now, para means beside. Cleat means advocate. So the followers of Jesus experienced the Paraclete, the Spirit, the experience of having an advocate beside us, enabling us to live the life of agape love. To live that life, Jesus was dead. What empowers us to live that life of agape love? The Paraclete, the advocate beside us. The experience of the presence of God at the Feast of the Pentecost, according to Luke, gave the followers the power to live differently, as the Apostle Paul clearly states throughout his letters. Now, let's remember an advocate beside the followers of Jesus, not ahead of, no pulling involved, not behind us, no pushing involved, but alongside us, an advocate encouraging us to live the life of agape love. That's the presence of God in God's Paraclete, Spirit, along beside us. Third, the meaning of Trinity that is oftentimes talked about in the context of this story in the book of Acts. First of all, when we look at the meaning of Trinity, it's important to note that there's no mention of the Trinity in the Christian or Hebrew libraries, not in the New or the Old Testament. The first recorded reference to the Trinity is discovered in writings is about 160, 100 years after Luke wrote his gospel and his story of the early movement. The Trinity was first defined as a doctrine in the Christian community in around 325 AD. 300 years after the death of Jesus, 250 years after Luke wrote his 2 volumes. And the community was struggling to define the relationship of Jesus and God, but to insert any understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity into the Acts of the Apostles, we would have to rewrite the book. The doctrine of the Trinity is a doctrine created by faithful persons trying to understand the relationship of Jesus and God. Luke's first story of the movement of the followers of Jesus is a story of God who is not to be understood, but rather to be experienced as an advocate beside the faithful, the Paraclete. Again, the story of the movement of the followers of Jesus is a story of God who is not to be understood, but rather is to be experienced as an advocate beside the faithful. Fourth, what's the meaning of the movement? The church, as we know it today, did not officially begin until the Roman emperor became a follower of the faith in 325 AD. This to me is the birth of the church, 325 AD, as we experience the church today. Pentecost was the empowerment of the faithful, followers committed to live the life of agape love and empathy and sacrifice for others, empowered by the Paraclete alongside those in the movement. The community was diverse, many languages. They were sent to share the stories of Jesus. The apostles were sent to share the stories of Jesus and to tell their own story of experiencing divine agape love and the commitment of sharing this gift with others. That's all the movement was. They received divine agape love in the life and teachings of Jesus, and the movement was those who were willing to share that story and their own story with others. Now, this first story of the movement is remarkably similar to the first story of Jesus in Luke's gospel. Remember, a dozen weeks ago, the parable of the new wine needing new wineskins. The story of the gift of the Spirit at the feast of the Pentecost is a new beginning for the early followers. It was again new wine. They couldn't depend on the laws which they had followed. They could no longer depend on personally experiencing the life and teachings of Jesus. The law was replaced. Jesus was dead. Rather, they could depend on the presence of divine love, the Paraclete, the advocate beside them, not in front pulling them, not in back pushing them, but alongside with them. Now, my take on Luke telling this first story is clearly the early followers capturing the message, Emmanuel. What does that mean? God with us. God alongside us forevermore. Yeah. At Pentecost, agape love was experienced, received, and shared. Indeed, the Paraclete empowered the movement. A whole bunch there, I say, about a semester full. Couple questions for your thought and conversation. Are these understandings of Pentecost, the Spirit, Trinity, and the movement helpful or confusing in your own personal journey of faith? And secondly, how will these understandings change your reading and study of the Acts of the Sent Ones as Jesus, No Strings Attached, Volume 2. Thank you for being a part of our journey.